Good? Okay, shkoyach for people who stay even though it's Friday afternoon for Shabbos. For all those who need a whiskey to get them through the shir, we can provide that as well. No, just, hopefully everyone will be happy with the conclusion, but maybe you won't be happy with it, I don't know. But anyway, it's going to be a fascinating shir about is whiskey kosher or not? Quite a famous controversy. So big shkoyach to Rabbi Klein from the Sydney Kollel for taking his time to share with us the shir. Take it away.
Okay, thank you, Rabbi Kouari and Rabbi Kouari and BINA for the opportunity to speak, and for Macharus Avi for helping discuss the ideas, coming on hearing, everyone who came on a busy Friday morning. So, just by way of introduction, first I heard a few comments, people perhaps didn't come other than being Friday morning because they're afraid of the outcome. So, hope that wasn't the case. If it is, it's tremendously immature, but they're not here so I can pass judgmental comments. A couple of people are listening on live stream, so it's, maybe that's part of it as well. All right, so in Chanukah, we obviously are celebrating the miracle that took place in times of the Greeks, and part of that is that we're celebrating the beauty of the Torah, the way the Torah illuminates our lives. And to me, there are sort of a few main areas where I think Torah really shines forth. One of them, which is I think what we're going to look at today in brief, which is when you look at a sugya, a topic in halacha, and see how the principles can be drawn from the earliest sources into all contemporary applications, that timelessness of the Torah is something, there's a real beauty and illumination I feel really shines a certain light on the Torah. So I think today we'll exploring some of the topics, we're going to see some of the beauty of the Torah in this topic. Now the next point I want to make is, as I sort of mentioned in a way of jest or half joking, that when it comes to halacha, certainly areas of halacha that are relevant to our lives, there is a very strong tendency to be selective in our listening. In the sense of, often we come into these kind of topics with foregone conclusions as to how we would like the topic to end. And so we either don't go to topics that we don't want to hear the answers to, or we go to speakers who think will give us the answer they're looking for. So I'm not sure anyone knows which way I'm going to go in terms of this year. And the truth is I'm going to go both ways, because the way of Torah is that there are almost always two or more legitimate opinions. And this is part of the beauty and depth of Torah, that we are a complex divine religion where things are not man-made. And because of the fact that there is a divine origin of the Torah, there are infinite perspectives that are possible on a divine knowledge base. So to have more than one opinion is almost intrinsic to the definition of what Torah is. So to assume that there is only one conclusion to a shir is also, I think, a misunderstanding of the depth and profundity of Torah. Now, of course, there might be inclined towards one or the other, but whether one is stringent or lenient, ultimately you should at least understand why you're taking a certain stance. Why am I lenient? Why am I strict? And of course, both those sides will be explored in the shir today. The other final remark in terms of the introduction is that there are two roles of a posek, of a halachic decider, in coming to a conclusion. It's something I got from my Rosh Kollel, Rabbi Kallis, and neither of which I can claim to be entirely, but you have to be both an expert in the halacha, in the law, and you also have to be an expert in the metzios, knowing the facts on the ground. And if you are only an expert in one and not the other, then you are not entitled to be a posek. So if you know the halacha, but you do not know the halachic reality or the factual reality on the ground to which you're applying the letter of the law, then you are not qualified to be a posek. And if you know the facts on the ground but don't know the halacha, you're also not qualified to issue a halachic ruling. So really to issue a ruling on the issue requires knowledge, in fact mastery of both the reality on the ground as well as the halacha as well. So we're going to, because of that, like I said, I'm not a posek based on those criteria, but in exploring the topic, we're going to look at both the facts on the ground, the history of whiskey production, of sherry cask whiskey, to understand how it's made, why it's made like that, to get a grasp of the metzios, of the practical reality, and then we'll similarly explore some of the halachic principles. Again, the principles here, I gave a shiur in the Kollel and Adas for a month on this topic. I mean, a month being 4 weeks of sessions, about 45 minutes each. So definitely, we can't cover all the halachic realities or issues in this short session now, but we will do our best to cover the main issues as they're relevant to the topic. So when it comes to whiskey, it was certainly a saying and a truism that whiskey is always kosher. That was traditionally the accepted practice and relationship to whiskey, is that whiskey and alcohols in general are always kosher. And in fact, there's a basis to this in the legislation, because there is actually Scotch legislation in Scotland about the different rules as to what criteria you need to meet to qualify as a Scotch whiskey. And by the way, whiskey from Scotland is with a Y without an E, and other whiskies are with an E. So to be Scotch whiskey with a Y without the E, you need to have certain regulations and protocols you follow. Those criteria always ensure that it is halakhically kosher. So you're only allowed basic ingredients, which are malted barley, which is basically barley that's allowed to be to fermented, yeast that's added, and then it's matured in oak casks. And there's a minimum of 3 years, and there's other rules they have, but you can't add anything else to be considered Scotch. So therefore, it was always correct to have assumed historically that whiskey is kosher, because you can't add anything other than the barley, the yeast, and the water in an oak cask. So there's nothing else. There is a colouring, caramel colouring you can add, which is also kosher. They don't always do it, but if they do add it, it's kosher. So there's nothing else they can add to whiskey. If you want to qualify under legislation as being whiskey, you have to be kosher by definition. And therefore, it was always accepted as kosher. Now, interesting, just like for those who like whiskey, there are certain whiskies known as being peaty, and they have a bit of a smoky flavour. So where does that come from? So part of the process of making the whiskey, they first soak the whiskey in various stages to allow it to ferment and to extract some of the enzymes from the barley. And then, but before they then distill it, they have to dry it. So they get these big fires and dry the whiskey. So it used to be that the coal that was used added a smoky flavour. So now they've changed how they do it. They use gas. And so your classic whiskey is not necessarily smoky because they dry it with gas fires rather than other coal, but the whiskies that want to bring out a unique peaty flavour, at this point, the stage when they're drying the barley, they use coal that adds the smoky flavour. So the smoky flavour comes out at the drying stage before it's distilled. They dry the barley with this coal that adds the peaty, smoky flavour. That's just parenthetically. Now, what adds taste? So if it's true that all you can add to whiskey is water, malted barley, and yeast in an oak cask, if you read the back of whiskies, you find all sorts of interesting taste.
You rely on with Mashiach, because that's the law, okay?
Yeah.
That and the models.
Yeah. In other words, there's an assumption that they're not going to add anything else. So, I mean, for example, other areas of halacha like Chalav Yisrael, there the halacha mandates the mashgiach as part of the halacha. Here, the chazaka, the working assumption would be that unless we can prove otherwise, they're following the law. So they'd have to have a reason why they're doing something else. So the question is, there are different tasting notes when it comes to whiskies. They have, cinnamon and vanilla and fruity tannins. So where does that come from if they're not adding anything but water, barley, in an oak cask? So this is an incredible thing, and I bring it out to understand, again, the factual reality here, but also I think to really appreciate the incredible world HaKadosh Baruch Hu made. Part of Hanukkah, there's this beautiful piece from Rav Soloveitchik. He's looking at the Rambam, and the bracha we make, She'asa Nisim L'Avoseinu. So the bracha we make on the menorah is Hashem did miracles to our forefathers. Then he says, Bayamim Haim, in those days. And then we usually say, Bazman Hazeh, in this time period. So he said that there's a version in the Rambam, in Maimonides, that says, Uvazman Hazeh, and in these times. And he says, what's the difference of that idea? He says, Uvazman Hazeh means that you're thanking Hashem for those miracles that occurred in yesteryear, in the times of the Chashmonayim in the Second Temple, and the miracles that occur to us today. So the Jewish way of thanking Hashem is to always include not only past miracles, but present miracles as well. And so as well, we'll see here, there's an incredible point here to thank Hashem for making a beautiful world, an incredible world. So where do these tastes come from if there's nothing else added? So the oak casks they use, the oak, you'd think it's just wood. What's wood good for? For storing things in barrels or fire or your table. No, actually there are flavors, there are different within the wood that are released through the soaking process, through the maturing in oak casks. Different, in fact, you have American oak casks and you have European oak casks. And these different casks, depending on the source of this wood, provide different flavors. In fact, even European oak casks It's actually generic because different parts of Europe actually have different types of wood. In fact, I was looking up, and I spent quite a lot of time researching this, as you can see. There are oak trees in Ukraine that are described as being like cement. Then you have, Spanish oak, French oak. So even though generally on the labels they say European or American oak is the two generic labels, there are actually many nuances, and each wood provides its own flavors and tasting notes. And so all these notes, they haven't added vanilla or strawberry to the whiskey. All they've done is that they've matured in different type of oak casks, and this is part of the genius and the art. But it's also part of the incredible world Hashem made. That who would have thought that Hashem made we're not only a beautiful world with greenery that we can appreciate, but that there's within these woods and these oaks there are flavors that you can extract from maturing whiskey. So next time you enjoy a whiskey, you think about the incredible world Hashem made. There's another point here, which is another incredible idea in terms of how it's made. So how do you make it? If you think about it, we understand that plastic can be melted into a shape. How do you get a wooden cask? I mean, for those who've seen a barrel, I actually was going to bring a picture of it, but a cask is basically, it's a wooden barrel. So you have these wooden staves, as they're known, that have been curved around to form a barrel. How do you curve wood? I mean, wood's hard by nature, and these are hard woods. So they have this process called toasting. So what they do is that they have these metal rings on the top of the barrel. It is placed over a fire. That fire softens the wood, but it also toasts the wood. So the inside of these barrels, sometimes you can see pictures of them, they're actually black because they've been toasted. That's the term. And that toasting softens the wood to the point that they can then bend it round into a shape of a barrel and then put these metal rings around it on both ends to contain it and keep it in the form of a barrel. That's known as toasting. Now the toasting not only softens the wood, but it actually also releases further tannins from the wood that provide different tasting notes. So not only is there a genius and an arty and incredible world Hashem gave us, that the woods have different flavors, but if you toast the wood to different levels, it releases different flavors. So you have light toasting, medium toasting, it's like a steak, right? So you have different grades of toasting, and each different grade of toasting releases different flavors. So it's not only you toasting it to allow the barrel to be formed from these hard wooden staves into a usable barrel, but there's an art here and a genius and an incredible world Hashem made for us that different grades of toasting release different flavors. And so each master blender of the whiskies has this plan as to what taste they're trying to release, and they decide how to toast it in terms of releasing those flavors. So it's an incredible science and art. And again, world that Hashem made us. There's another step which is not always done, which is called charring. So charring is a further state of burning. There's this incredible picture of this barrel with these huge flames of fire coming out of the barrel. That's known as charring. That's actually a legal requirement for bourbon. For whatever reason, it's a sort of flavor it brings out of the wood again when you add this extra toasting stage called charring, and that's mandatory for bourbon. Let's see, bourbon casks or ex-bourbon casks are often used as well in the whiskey production. So that's the basic concept of how whiskey is made. That's how you get different flavors. So the flavouring principle is coming, obviously, the type of where the water's from. There's also an amazing thing. Like Rashi says in the Chumash that the fish in Akko tastes different to the fish in Ashkelon. It's the same fish, the same species of fish, but depending on where you find it, has different flavors, which is an amazing thing that Hashem made, that the water isn't just H2O, but depending on where you find that water, the water has different flavor. So the different flavors in the whiskey are from the water, where's the water from, which type of grain you're using, and also the different type of oak casks. Is it American oak, is it European oak? What degrees of toasting has it been through? What was the intensity of the heat? Was it charred? Those are all the different influencing factors. And also was there this peaty? Was it dried using peaty coal that provides the smoky flavour? So those are the different influences on the taste of a whiskey. So not as simple as we might have thought.
Is there some sort of lifetime that use the oak barrel for? Because there must be a limit to the amount of flavour that
Sure.
extract.
So the minimum for whiskey to be matured is 3 years, I mentioned. Most are minimum of 10. Some, so you have ones that are 40 years, but they can be used up to 4 or 5 times. So if you think about it, if the average whiskey, let's say, is matured for 10 years in a cask, it's going to be at least 50 years of use per barrel, but it could be much more. So yeah, they do have quite a life. Now, so where does sherry come into this? Why is there discussion about sherry casks? So what happened is that so sherry is a type of fortified wine produced in what's known as the Sherry Triangle region in Spain, in southern Spain, and that was a popular drink in Scotland. Now, some suggest it was popular because there were ex-Scotsmen who went to Spain to produce this wine. There was a certain national heritage there that the Scotsmen were making this wine in Spain. But be it as it may, it was a popular drink in Scotland. So what would happen is that they would send these casks to, they sent these casks that had the sherry wine. And then sherry wine, as it was said second, is not kosher. So sherry wine was maturing in these casks, and they were sending it to Scotland in casks, in oak casks. Now, interesting to point out, there's a bit of a misnomer here, the casks they sent to Scotland were not the casks that the wines matured in. Because these are known as Solera casks, and there's this whole complex system, which I'm not going to go into now because of time, but if anyone's interested, I can tell you afterwards. But there's this complex system where they reuse the casks again and again, and in fact, the casks they use for sherry, for the wine, are always old casks. They're known as non-active, because with sherry you don't want the wood taste influencing the wine. Whereas with the whiskey, you want the wooden taste to impart the whiskey. With wine, you don't. So therefore, they use old casks. So actually, those casks they keep in Spain, and unless the cask breaks, they always reuse them again and again and again and again for as long as they can. So they had these new wooden casks they would send to transport the sherry to Scotland. They then didn't have anything to do with them. So after a few uses, the Scotsmen who were looking for casks for their whiskies bought them for a good mitzvah, for a good bargain. Now, in the mid to late 19th century, whiskey became more popular globally, and they needed more casks. And at a similar time, there was a decline in the popularity of sherry, and also there was a new regulation in the 1960s that emerged where they, instead of bottling, so I missed that point, they used to send it to Scotland, and it was bottled in Scotland. The sherry being sent to Scotland. I mean, this new rule, the sherry had to be bottled in Spain. So they were no longer sending these sherry casks, these oak casks, sherrying them to Scotland to be bottled in Scotland. They were being bottled locally in Spain. So the consequence was that there was now a lack of oak casks available in Scotland to mature the whiskies in. Because previously they'd been sending these sherry casks, these casks of sherry in them to Scotland, and they were using them for their whiskies. They were no longer available. So they started buying bourbon casks. So in America there was bourbon, it's a much shorter process of maturing, so there's an abundance of bourbon casks available in the market. They were far cheaper than in these now rare Spanish sherry casks. They started buying ex-bourbon casks from America. Again, at this point in time they had no idea that sherry had any impact on the wine. They just thought that it was simply a commercial issue of there were previously cheap sherry casks that had sherry in them. They were using them for their whiskies. It suddenly became uncommercial, non-commercial to use the sherry ones, so they simply made a commercial decision to buy the ex-bourbon casks. Suddenly, 10, 15 years later, as their new whiskies coming out, their consumers and their subscribers suddenly start saying, hang on a second, have you changed your recipe? Because the whiskies suddenly start tasting different. They said, no, we haven't changed the recipe. And they realized what they've done is they've changed, they're not using sherry casks anymore, they're using bourbon casks. And so there's something about what the sherry does to the oak that it brings out a unique flavour that didn't exist in the bourbon casks. Suddenly they realised, hang on a second, there are people who like the sherry cask. So they stopped buying them because it was non-commercial and it wasn't in their financial interest to buy the sherry cask. I said, hang on a second, maybe it's worthwhile buying the sherry cask for a premium and charging a premium to our snobbish, single malt consumers who want the sherry taste in the whiskey, assuming that anyone can actually taste it and they're not just buying it for the snobbish value. So the experts say they can taste it. So they started making these things so that they were either purchasing these rare casks from Spain at a premium, but charging a premium to the consumers, or they actually started making their own sherry-infused casks in Scotland. So they basically made the cask, put some sherry in them for a year or two, and then used them for the whiskey afterwards. So that's the brief history of sherry casks, how they came to be used, what impact it has, and why they stopped using them, why they started using them again, and now they're on these labels, all fancy, or many fancy whiskeys have this sherry cask as part of the marketing spiel, and that's because they pay much more money to get a sherry cask, and they're hoping you as a consumer think that it's now a better whiskey and prepared to pay a premium for that as well. So what we're going to have to look at, and we're going to start looking at the halakhic side of it, is what impact does this have on halacha? So how does Jewish law see the status of the sherry that is now apparently perceivable and detectable in your whiskey? So we have to look at a few basic principles. We'll define some basic terms, and then we'll explore some of the halachic issues. So the first concept is called stam yainam. This is referred to as wine produced by a non-Jew. In the Gemara, there was something called yain nesech, which was wine that was used for idolatrous purposes. It's not what it is. It's not necessarily idolatrous. This is rabbinic, and that was a biblical prohibition because it was associated with idolatry. And idolatry obviously is against not only the Torah, but even the 7 principles of Noach. And Stam Yainam is a rabbinic enactment to prohibit wine produced by non-Jews. Now, if I ask you, is there anything not kosher about these wines? In essence, no. It's just grapes. It's been pressed and matured as the kosher wine. So what's different about them is they were made by non-Jews. So why is that something that make it non-kosher? The answer is, so the main explanation given is it was a fear of intermarriage. So if I can drink your wines, if we can dine together, and we can have wine together, then there is a higher risk of intermarriage. So there's a few of these rabbinic decrees when it comes to fine wining and dining, where Chazal, where the rabbis instituted various decrees to try and curtail and limit some of our dining habits, to try and actually make it difficult, which is difficult. And for those who do business, it becomes quite cumbersome sometimes. And there's a reason for it, because we don't want it to be easy to wine and dine with non-Jews, because that certainly increases our chance of intermarriage, as the facts speak for themselves. That's the first concept. So why is this sherry not kosher? Not because there's any non-kosher ingredients in it, but because it was made by by non-Jews, and therefore that makes it rabbinically prohibited, called stam yainam. The next concept is called blios, or absorptions. So again, in the way we're describing the issue of sherry cask whiskey, there is no sherry being poured into the whiskey. So if there's no sherry in the whiskey, why should there be a halakhic issue? So if we can accept that the rabbis forbade sherry like all other wines, because we don't want to have intermarriage, which hopefully we can all appreciate that, but there's no sherry here. So I haven't added sherry. In fact, I'm not allowed to add sherry because Scotch whiskey is not allowed to have any other ingredients added to it. So why should there be a halakhic issue? So here we have this concept called blios. Blios means an absorption. Now, just to try and make it practical, if you've ever noted on your coffee mug, which you may not have noted, but have a look tonight or tomorrow morning when you're next to drink coffee, even though we have very clean hygienic standards in our kitchens, and generally speaking, most people, I hope, we scrub out their cups after use, they put them in the dishwasher, there's all sorts of soaps and hot water going through them, you'll find a brown stain on the bottom of your coffee mug. Now, why is there a stain? I mean, you can't take coffee off the bottom of your mug. It's been cleaned, it's been scrubbed, it's been hosed down in your dishwasher. So why is there a stain? So incredibly, most people haven't even thought about this, but actually there is a bit of the coffee that has been absorbed into your coffee mug. How? Through heat. So the heat of the coffee has created staining on your coffee mug because it is porous. It's somewhat porous. It's not totally porous, but it's not a sponge, but it's somewhat porous. It can absorb contents, and therefore it has gone. In fact, if you look at even these paper cups you've got, there's always a discoloration afterwards. Why is so over the gill's got a T. There'll be some yellow or brown, sort of brownie on the sides. Why? Because a bit of that has absorbed into the cup. So we might think it's some kind of archaic thing. No, in fact, if you look at your cups, there are certainly paper, porcelain kind of things are all somewhat absorbent, and so they're actually absorbed. Some of that taste, some of those contents are absorbed into the cup. That's known as blios. Now, halachically we say, those blios, same way they can be absorbed into the cup, they can be released into the contents of your next usage of that cup or that vessel. So if you use that cup again, similarly if you drink coffee in a paper cup, and then you use that if you then pour boiling water into the cup, definitely the paper cup for sure. Again, our porcelain cups are less porous, but the paper cup is much more porous. You pour water in there, you will see some brown discoloration of your water. It won't be clear water. Why not? I poured clear water into the cup because the answer is that it's able to extract some of those blios, some of those absorptions from the wall of the paper cup into the drink. That's our second concept, to realize that, so to apply it to the sherry, yes, I haven't added sherry to the cask, to the whiskey, but since the sherry was absorbed, and wood is quite porous, so if you leave a piece of wood in a liquid, even without heat, you just soak it. Then our next concept, you just soak wood in wine, you'll see it's red. Give it a day, 2 days, and this is 18 years, you've got plenty of time to soak things up. You soak up wine for a number of years in a piece of wood, it'll be red. Why? Because it's porous. So these oak barrels are very porous. In fact, I actually mentioned before, part of that toasting stage that happens when they try and form the barrels, form those casks, allows it to be more porous because the heat opens up some of the wood to make it more porous, that it's now more absorbent, which they want, because it can release. How do those oak casks influence flavour? So we mentioned there's certain tannins and various flavours hidden and captured in the oak wood. How is that released? The same process. When you soak the whiskey, forget the sherry, just when you soak whiskey in the wood, that whiskey soaks into the wood and is then released back into the barrel, and that's why you have different flavours. So you see clearly, everyone understands, before you even get to halacha and sherry, any whiskey expert will explain to you that the reason why there's a flavour in your whiskey is because it's been absorbed into the barrel, into the cask, and released back inside, and taken those flavours from the wood with it.
Well, would the same apply to traver fats? That if Goyim had used the cask for storing fats in or something like that?
It could be anything. Anything certainly, so if it's liquid, if it soaks in there, or if there's heat, it's able to be absorbed into a porous material and released again.
Yeah.
So we're having the concept of stam yainom, the non-kosher wine, fear of intermarriage. We have blios. You have something can be absorbed, and we've seen here with our coffee cups, our tea cups, and with
still defined as the same product.
So that's interesting. So in halacha, we do consider it to be the same product because it has the same taste. So that's the next concept called tam ki'ikar, and that is we say although the object, I haven't poured sherry into my whiskey, but it has the taste of sherry. So that's considered as though sherry has been absorbed into the cask and is now being released back out. But that's actually a question we'll consider maybe another way of looking at it. But at face value, the sherry goes into the oak cask. It's very porous. It's released again along with the other flavors of the oak. And so now I have not only the smoky or the vanilla or the fruity flavors coming out of my oak, I now have a sherry flavor coming out of my oak as well. We apply tam ki'ikar if the taste is like the thing itself. So we've also got sherry being imparted into the whiskey as well.
Is there a bottle of shishim?
We'll get there. We're jumping the gun. Okay, but obviously we'll mention that. Now we have the next point called kavush. So what is the process that we extract and create this transfer of taste? So there's no heat over here. In your classic pot or in your coffee cup or your tea cup, there's heat. That heat has the power of transfer of flavour. Here's the power of soaking. So soaking even for 24 hours in halakha is called kavush, and that allows something to seep into a porous material. Here you've got plenty of time, you've got years and years and years. If something's porous, it definitely is able to soak in and release flavours in a two-direction manner. Now, Rabbi Amzak mentioned the idea of kavush, of bittul. So next stage is, okay, so now we've established that oak casks are very porous. They release flavours into the whiskey. When it's a sherry cask, so where there's been sherry absorbed into that wood previously, it's also releasing sherry. And as we mentioned, people desired that flavour, which is why after they switched to bourbon casks, they started bringing back a select few sherry casks. People liked that taste. So it seems to be that it was imparting a positive taste to the whiskey. Now, I have this concept called bittul. So bittul means to nullify something. So in halacha we can say that although there is a trace of something in the ingredients, if it is a negligible quantity or impact on the final product, we say it is halachically negligible, and therefore we can disregard it. That's known in halacha as called bittul, to nullify something. So we'll see about the measure in a second. So generally, for example, if I have my chicken soup and I accidentally spill a drop of milk into my chicken soup, and there's a large pot of soup with a drop of milk, there you will not taste. You can ask the world's best expert, you will not taste a drop of milk in a large vat of chicken soup. So therefore it becomes negligible. We disregard that. That's called bittul. And as we're mentioning here, there's a concept called bittul b'shishim. So a general ratio for discerning if something no longer imparts taste is if you have a 1 to 60 ratio. Because shishim in Hebrew is 60. So 1 to 60 is no bittul b'shishim. We can disregard it once it's no longer imparting a taste. Once you have 60 to 1 ratio, we assume there's no taste being imparted. Now, with that in mind, and one other concept just to introduce, is called pagum. So pagum means something is, if it's a defective taste. So you can have something that imparts taste, but if it's a defective taste, so if it ruins the taste, then even though you can perceive the taste, it's not negligible, it's perceptible, but it has a negative impact on the final product. Then we say it's called pagum, and therefore it is a ruined taste, and that also is acceptable at least after the fact in halacha. So for example, one example in the Shulchan Aruch was if you use a wine barrel and you then put water in that barrel. So as was said, the water is going to soak into the barrel, a bit of that wine will come out. That is okay in halacha. As long as the barrel was cleaned beforehand, I can reuse the wine barrel for water, because any wine flavour which will inevitably come out into the water is considered a negative flavour. I want water in my barrel. When I pour my cup of water from this barrel and there's this very mild taste of wine in there, that is a negative impact on my cup of water. I don't want a weak wine flavoured water. I want water. So as far as my water is concerned, that wine, although the wine's not kosher, that was non-kosher wine in this barrel, previously stored, so just to make that clear. But the impact or the impact of that wine on the water in the barrel is negative, it's pagum, we can disregard it. So those are the principles we need to now look at the sherry cask and try and dissect it somewhat.
Is there a differential between accidental putting something in and deliberate putting something in?
Yes, that's also a difference as well. Yeah, we'll have to consider that as well. So generally we say bittul, it's the idea of disregarding something. As you're saying, Rudy, when it comes to disregarding something, of course, there's a difference if you put it on purpose or if it's put in by accident. Because to say it's negligible and we're disregarding it, but I put it there on purpose, well, why did I put it there on purpose? Right? And also perhaps there might have been a penalty for doing that on purpose as well. So that's the question. Now, another question to consider though is, when we talk about having a nullified on purpose, you have to ask who is doing it and for whom. So again, if it was me making whiskey out of my garage for the local community, then we have to say that there might be a serious problem about me adding, whether that's by pouring in or allowing it to soak, if I'm making it for the Jewish community, because I am, even if we can establish, we'll have to see if that's true or not, even if we can establish that the sherry taste has been negated, it's become mevutal, it's batel, but I've done it on purpose. So that will be a problem. But here the Scotsmen are definitely not Jewish, and they're making it primarily for a non-Jewish market. So at face value, that will not become an issue, at least on a basic halachic level. There is a stringency that says if there's been any kind of bittul employed in the process, that might be reason to be stringent, but from a technical baseline halacha, it'll be okay because it was done by non-Jews for a primarily non-Jewish market. So we'll leave it at that in terms of the way we dissect it. So the key point here is going to be to figure out, well, we've already established that there is non-kosher wine absorbs here, and then it's released. Logic tells us, and halakha tells us, that taste is released into the whiskey through the maturing process when it's soaked in these barrels. Applying the principle of tam ki'ikar, that the taste is like the object is there, we will then ascertain that you have sherry, traces of sherry at least, in our whiskey. So at face value, that should mean that render all whiskies with sherry in them non-kosher. So for those who've researched the topic a little bit, there are different opinions, of course. Now, where do these opinions emerge from? So there are many issues that I mentioned in the introduction, which we can't look at all of them, but we'll try and look at the 2 or 3 key issues halachically that are discussed here, from which these 2 different approaches, the stringent and the lenient views, emerge. So I think, to me, the key question here is the taste that we can perceive in the whiskey, is it halachically considered a forbidden taste or not? Well, so you might ask, based on an introduction, why wouldn't it be forbidden taste? Sherry is not kosher. I can apparently taste sherry again. And there's a point here that we rely on the experts, because I think the average consumer perhaps can't tell that there's sherry in there. Or you could debate the point. I'll probably
how do you establish time?
I'd probably get in trouble. Sorry?
How do you establish that the taste, you taste the taste?
So that's a very
experts move.
So that's a very interesting point.
95% of the people can't taste it because like a spiteful taste.
So I have 2 points here to make. One is, from a practical perspective, is although it might be true that your average whiskey drinker could not ascertain that there's sherry in this. If you blindfolded him and gave him a cup of whiskey, he might not be able to tell you there's sherry in there. But I believe that your average whiskey consumer, who's not just doing it because for peer pressure, because he enjoys whiskey, if you gave him 2 cups and he's blindfolded, he'd tell you the taste different. So, yeah, this is my own opinion. I'm not reading this, but to me, logically, that would suggest that the average consumer can tell there's sherry. They just don't have the sophistication to know that what they're tasting on their palate is called sherry, or a sherry imparted taste. But the fact that they can say this is different to that, I don't know why it's different, but it's different, to me says that even the average consumer, not just drinking it for peer pressure, actually can tell the difference. But aside from that, it seems to be in halacha, we are interested in the view of the experts, because you find at the beginning of your Odeya in Tzadiches, there in Shulchan Aruch, it talks about if you're not sure if you have milk that's spilled into your meat, if it has taste, you ask an expert. So it seems to be that we do rely on experts in any case, but to me, I think the average consumer can actually tell the difference. That's my thought on it. So if I have sherry in there, why would it be allowed? So here, Rav Moshe Feinstein, those who haven't heard of Rav Moshe Feinstein, it's hard to really sum him up, in any short space of time, other than to say he was a man who belonged thousands of years before his time, or hundreds of years before his time. And Rav Moshe Feinstein has a very fundamental tshuva that it has bearing on this. Now, he actually was asked a question, not the same as our question of sherry casks. It was a slightly modified question where Rav Teitz, who was in Elizabeth, New Jersey, was a mashgiach. He was producing a whiskey with a hechsher, with a rabbinic certification. And he was writing to Rav Moshe to say that the whiskies that had sherry in them should be a problem. Now, what was he describing? Okay, we have to say an introduction. You have to be a postsec, you have to be a halachic expert, you have to know the facts on the ground. So he was saying that they were actually adding, so part of their blended whiskies, so not a single malt, a blended whiskey, they were actually pouring up to 2.5% of sherry, as in the total volume, they were pouring sherry into their whiskies. And he was saying, this is a criminal from a halachic perspective. So Rav Moshe writes back a number of issues, but his key point is as follows. So we mentioned before the concept of bittul. So if something is negligible in our final product, then we can disregard that halachically. Okay? And we also mentioned, so what's the name again? David. So David also mentioned that generally the ratio to establish bittul, nullification, is 1 to 60. So is that true when it comes to wine? So here there's a major dispute, but Rav Moshe, his ruling on the matter is that with wine, you only need a ratio of 1 to 6. Unlike other prohibited items where you need 1 to 60 to nullify the taste, you only need 1 to 6 for wine. So sherry, but for wine, for all wines. Why is it different? So this is firstly he says that this is how it's ruled in Shulchan Aruch, but he explains the difference as follows. When it comes to, let's say, if I accidentally drop a bit of milk in my chicken soup, or if someone has intentionally or accidentally placed, let's say, some prawns in my dish, I need to make sure that there is no longer any remnant of the taste of that non-kosher ingredient in my final outcome. Generally, the ratio, as we mentioned, is 1 to 60 to ensure that it no longer imparts taste. With wine, says Rav Moshe, it works differently. Let's say I pour a cup of water here. Here's a cup, I'm thirsty. I have my cup here. If I pour into this cup 1 part wine and 3 parts water, what's it going to taste like? Sorry?
It tastes like weak wine.
Weak wine. Okay? So there'll definitely be a wine flavour. If it's 1 part wine, 3 parts water, I'll definitely taste wine here. But is that a wine that I'm going to want to celebrate with? Right? Well, even, and in fact, if I ask you, is that wine or is that wine flavoured? If you want to be very legal about it. You probably say at this point it's wine flavoured. So Rav Moshe says that, so when it comes to wine is not your average, in this case, non-kosher product. Because why is wine, and we see wine definitely is given a special status when it comes to Jewish culture, tradition. Every Jewish celebration has a cup of wine there. Your kiddush, your weddings, your brit milah, there's always a cup of wine there. Wine is considered chashul, it's important, it's significant. Why is it better than orange juice? Orange juice comes from a fruit. I've squeezed oranges to create juice, and I squeeze grapes and I create juice. So why is it better than grape juice? So the answer is because through maturing, it achieves a certain status and taste and symbol of something of stature. Now, once wine is diluted, Moshe calls it kiyur ba'alma, which basically I want to translate to explain it practically to mean that it's just wine-flavored water. So yes, you can taste the wine. So on your classic ratio and standard of 1 to 60, you haven't got that. And you can definitely taste the wine flavor, but it's not wine. It's called grape flavor or wine flavor. But it's lost the status of wine. So the reason why wine was forbidden, now it's true technically grape juice is also problematic. If a non-Jew made grape juice, it would also be an issue as the stam yenom, but perhaps it also is because it could ferment to become wine, so it's not, so it could be that's part of the umbrella of what could become wine. But in principle, grape juice, or let's say a grape flavoring, is not wine. In principle, and I say principle because practically we do give the status of wine, but again, perhaps because it can ferment to become wine, but technically it's just, once it's a wine flavored, it's just like grape juice or orange juice. So the reason why this wine was forbidden, again, there was no non-kosher ingredients, it was made by a non-Jew. There's a concern from most views of intermarriage. If I have grape flavor, we're not going to sit down for a business meeting or for a social gathering and have wine flavored water. Well, we could, but the rabbis didn't go so far as to forbid such social interactions. You can drink water with a non-Jew, with your business partner or your neighbor, but to drink wine is more problematic. So once it's only wine flavor, says Rav Moshe, and what's the ratio there? So there it says 1 to 6. Now, I'm just going to throw something interesting out there, curveball. It's not written in this discussion, but in the Gemara and the Shulchan Aruch, there was an understanding that wine was very strong, and therefore it could be diluted quite a bit until we said it's no longer wine. Now, our wines are much weaker, and therefore there's actually halachically a question: if you were given wine, for example, let's say when it comes to kiddush, your cup should be full. And therefore you should try, if you can, let's say you're running a bit short, you should try and add something to get it up to the top, because again, part of the significance of making kiddush is not a full cup of wine. So you can add a little bit of water to get it up to the top, and that would be preferable than having, depending on how empty it was, that might be preferable halachically. Now, if you add a little bit of water to your wine, it very quickly gets ruined. So it's interesting to consider, I haven't seen it written down by anyone, but whether perhaps we could have a lower ratio today, given our wines are weaker. So it's throwing out there, I haven't seen it written, so we can't rely on that. But
talking about the Yain of the Gemara, or Mishra's talking about the Arya?
He's talking about, he's also talking in his time, so he doesn't say it. So presumably he disagrees with what I'm saying. I'm just wondering aloud why we don't say that. But he leaves it with the ratio of the Gemara, Shulchan Aruch, that it's 1 to 6. If you have 1 to 6, although you can taste it, for wine we'll say it is batel, it is nullified. Now he does note there that there are opinions that disagree, and that like with every other forbidden ingredient, every other isur, you need 1 to 60 to say that it is halachically negligible. So here we have already two divergent approaches. The lenient view is going to rely on this Rav Moshe to say, if we can ascertain, we'll have to look at the next point, if we can say this 1 to 6 ratio against any sherry that's coming out into the whiskey, Rav Moshe will tell us say, and the predominant view would be like Rav Moshe perhaps, that it should be allowed. If you take the more stringent approach and say you need 1 to 60, then obviously probably you won't have that, and therefore you'd have to be stringent about a sherry cask whiskey. So let's see now, do we have, why are we stringent? Because if you say you need 1 to 60, what you're saying is, as long as it's imparting taste, I can perceive the sherry. It's now it's not negligible in halacha. So it's like a poor bit of sherry in there, and that should be forbidden because I can't consume sherry. So that's to me the most critical issue in the sugya is to figure out, do I have sherry taste in my whiskey? Factually, we've definitely established that I have something coming out of the wood which seems to taste like sherry. That, if it's perceptible, if you follow the 1 to 60 ratio, it'll be a problem. If you say it's 1 to 6 and you have 1 to 6, although it's true I can still taste it, but that's not sherry anymore, that's sherry flavor. That's not the chashivus, the status, the importance of wine, and therefore it'll be allowed, according to the lenient view of 1 to 6. So, do we have 1 to 6 in our sherry casks against the whiskey, against the sherry? So how do you, this is actually very, so those who are mathematically inclined, it's quite a lot of fun. I'm not going to go into all the numbers because I don't want to throw anyone off. And actually, it would be better if there was a picture here, which I was going to do, bring a picture along. But basically, for those who are a little bit inclined mathematically, to figure out whether you have a ratio of 1 to 6 or 1 to 60, what you have to ascertain first is how much of the thickness or volume of the walls of the casks have sherry absorbed in them. And then if you look at the volume of the walls of the cask and the volume of the internal contents of the barrel, you figure out what is the ratio of the volume of the walls of the cask against the internal volume. So that's a basic mathematical equation, the formulas for figuring that out. Now, I mentioned now that you have to figure out the ratio of the entire thickness of the wall versus the volume of the internal volume of the cask. Now, this is controversial. And this, I think, is a really key point. And we're going to come along on this busy Friday to come along here. And this is a really controversial point. How much sherry has been absorbed into the wooden cask? Okay, because this is critical because we'll see in a moment that those who've done the numbers ascertain that in most cases, at least the cases that were tested, you will not even have 1 to 6. So even if you figure out the strict opinion of 1 to 60, you will not have a 1 to 6 ratio. It's quite phenomenal, but it's been measured. You will not have 1 to 6 of the volume of the walls against the internal volume of the cask. So sherry casks by law, by the way, sorry, whiskey casks by law have to be less than 700 litres.
Very bad math.
So basically, sorry?
Is that a problem?
It's a problem, right? So in other words,
less than 1.
yeah, sorry. Yeah. So in other words, let's say your average cask has 600 litres of whiskey inside the cask. So to have 1 to 6, I would say there are 100 litres, which sounds like a lot of whiskey, right? Or a lot of sherry. You have to, so the volume of the wall would have to be less than 100 litres. The volume of the walls of the cask to be nullified 1 to 6 in the internal volume.
There's a logical flaw in that, in my view.
Why?
That would only apply if the wall was 100% sherry.
Okay, we'll get to that in a second.
It
David.
might be 1%.
100% right. That's part of the controversy here. But I'm just trying to make it just go step by step.
Yeah.
So to figure out the ratio here, we look at the volume of sherry absorbed in the wall of the cask, and then the internal volume, and see do I have 1 to 6. Yeah, 1 to 6 you're not going to have. So mathematically, just to bring out some numbers that were done here, another way of doing it is looking at the internal dimensions of the barrel versus the external dimensions of the barrel. So what is the volume of the entire barrel, including the walls? And you subtract from that the internal volume of the barrel, excluding the walls. So there are a few tests done. One test, fascinatingly, was that actually the entire thickness of one barrel tested was 135 litres of volume of the wall. Okay? Compared to, let's say, 500 litres of internal volume. So that is 26%. 1 to 6 is 16.7%. So in that case it was done, there was much more than 1/6, so that would be a problem. Other measurements done, there was this MMY journal in Yerushalayim seminary. This girl who was more mathematically inclined did some tests. Her name was Rosie Weinstein, and she used her formulas mathematically to do a similar test, and she came out that the average cask had 3.8 to 5.2 ratio. So all less than 1 to 6. So all more than 1 to 6. With all the casks that she tested, if you assume the entire volume of the walls, we'll get in a second, are absorbed with taste, with sherry, you would not have a 1 to 6 ratio. That would mean it would be, with that knowledge, it would be non-kosher. So the question David is very bothered by is, well, can you halachically accept, or scientifically accept, that the entire volume of the wall is saturated with sherry? Now, because I said, well, this is probably the most controversial point in my opinion as to how we rule on a sherry cask whiskey. Because halachically in the Shulchan Aruch, there are 2 views given when it comes to sherry cask, just a barrel that had wine soaked in, how much wine soaks in to the walls of the barrel. One view says what's called a kedei klippa, a peel. So if you peeled away a strip of, let's say, wood from the cask, that was as thin as a potato peel, or the like, and just took that off, so he shaves it off the internal wall of the cask, it would now be kosher. Because they say only that minuscule amount of wood absorbed taste. The stringent view says that the entire thickness, the entire volume absorbed. Now, do they know for a fact the entire volume is saturated with whatever the contents is? No, they don't. In fact, it seems to be a doubt. In other words, the Shach suggests, one of the commentators of the Shulchan Aruch, we don't know how far it absorbs into it. So if you don't know, you would act stringently to assume the worst case scenario, which may not be true, but could be.
What we have to do, there's a way of testing it very easily,
Go on.
in my view. You get a dry barrel and you weigh it, and then you soak it
Right.
In sherry or whatever else, the fluids you want to test, you empty it and you weigh it again. Then you will have a weight difference
Yeah.
between the dry wood and the sherry absorbed wood.
Yeah.
I suspect, subject to that actually being experimented and tested, that it might be a few litres.
I may interrupt, that doesn't work. And the reason why it
Why?
doesn't work is because sherry sits in the casks for an extended period of time. And over that period of time, it absorbs deeper into the barrel.
So you've got to
You would have to do an experiment where you actually took the stars or the barrel, soaked it in water. First of all, absorbs differently to sherry. Put it in sherry, put it for the exact same amount of time.
Okay, but we have to pause here. David, we have to stop going. We have 5.
Get your old barrel and compare it to a new barrel. Your old barrel might be
Okay, so
about 10 years old. So
It just has to be the same amount of time because it takes a.
Absolutely, there are plenty of old barrels to.
okay, David, we'll have to pause it here. There's only 5 minutes left. It's a fascinating and very relevant point. In fact, there are many overtones of this. There are many ramifications of this question you're posing as far as kashrus in general. So the fact that we say you have to have separate milk and meat pots is linked to the same question.
Yeah.
So this is another topic to explore that obviously has bearings on this issue here. And it's also linked to the question of whether we say it's a halachic reality or a scientific reality that we're concerned about. Now, just as a tangent, again, there's hours of material here to discuss, but just to mention as an aside, one of the tests they try to do, assuming it's scientific, what we're measuring here, is that they cut a barrel open to see how far there is staining, which is similar to a different way of trying to achieve what you're trying to do. And there are different reports as to what you find. Some say you don't find much stain, you're only a very thin layer. Others say you find it saturated all the way through. Perhaps it depends on, like we mentioned before, not all oaks are created equal. You know, South Africans had other meanings, right? But every oak has its own chemical properties. We also mentioned there are different types of toasting that takes place that also affects the absorbency of the wood. So we mentioned some casks are toasted heavily to release a different tasting palette or tasting notes. That will be more absorbent. So it could be that one guy got unlucky or one guy got lucky when he cut the barrel open. It could be there were simply different types of oak with different types of charring or toasting, as you mentioned. But it happens to be there are people who have tested it and then basically have claimed that there's sherry staining throughout the entire cask, or at least the majority of it. There are those who say that it's minimal, and that's part of the question here, which is, even the scientific evidence, which side of that support. So it's not really resolved even in the Shulchan Aruch, which is the predominant view. There are heavyweights on both sides of the scales here in terms of is it only this thin peel, is it more, and based on the introduction we said before, again, to be a postic, you have to know the halachic reality and the facts on the ground. The answer is it probably depends. Because it probably depends on the type of oak, how many times it's being used. Sorry? Every distillery is going to be different. So the question is, it's very hard to sort of have a broad, we like broad sweeping generalizations, say all sherries are okay, all sherry casks are not okay. But in reality, the facts tell us that we have to be somewhat discerning or discriminating to say, well, it depends on the distillery, it depends on the wood being used, and there could in fact be certain whiskies where the entire volume of the wall is saturated with sherry, and that would be an issue, because you wouldn't have 1 to 6, and there might be whiskies where it's less. So how do you know? So this is just one final concluding thought. Again, there's a lot more to discuss over here, but two concluding thoughts. One is that keeping in mind the issur here, the prohibition of the wine in the first place, of the sherry, is rabbinic. So some would like to suggest that you can say sofek d'rabbanan l'kula. If we have an uncertainty in regards to a rabbinic ruling, the rabbis themselves, not because it's not important, because the rabbis themselves told us we can act leniently, and perhaps if we're not sure, you could be lenient. Now, this is a broader question of kashrus, which is, well, maybe you have to find out, and how difficult is it to find out? And that's more of a kashrus issue from a kashrus agency, who have means of finding things out. Perhaps they do have to do research. In other words, these things can be verified, which kind of casks they're using, how was it charred, how was it toasted, which kind of oak, and those things have chemical consequences for our whiskies. Perhaps you have to find out. So perhaps ignorance is not bliss, and perhaps you can't just simply say, we can be lenient because it's rabbinic. Perhaps from the consumer, if you don't know better, maybe you can. Perhaps from the kashrus agency, perhaps you can't. And to finish with the story, someone just posted on one of the groups I'm on WhatsApp, there's a mashgiach in, I forget it was in America somewhere, and he was a mashgiach at a kiddush at a shul in America. And the mashgiach came along and confiscated a bottle of Macallan, $300 Macallan whiskey. There was a sherry cask Macallan. And as you can imagine, the purchaser of this whiskey was definitely not, was more than unpleased about this. And he says, do you know who I am? How dare you take my whiskey away from him? And he says, look, I don't really care who you are. Do you know who I am? I'm the mashgiach, and the rules being set by the agency that I am enforcing are that we do not allow sherry casks at our simcha. And so the article sent around, and the people in the group were saying it's ridiculous. And in fact, this mashgiach quotes the Starkane CRC as saying they agree that it is not allowed. And so someone on the group posted and said, well, hang on a second, if you look at the CRC's website themselves, they give two rulings. They have a lenient view and a strict view. And again, as I said before, we can't possibly, in this short session, look at all the different issues. But the issues we looked at, you can see there definitely are pathways for a lenient and a stringent approach. But just the final thought is that, as I said before, whether we're lenient because there's this rabbinic doubt, or that you can find out more, perhaps differentiates a kashrus agency and a regular consumer. Because perhaps if you're employing a kashrus agency to make sure your simcha, or celebration is kosher, perhaps you expect a higher standard to be enforced, and perhaps they have an obligation to provide a higher standard of kashrus, which perhaps does not give scope when there are definitely many factors to be stringent over here, and perhaps your average consumer is different. So to conclude, there definitely is a basis to be lenient. There are a lot of grounds to be stringent as well. When Moshe's view is, he has this phrase called a bal nefesh, someone who is spiritually exalted. Chanukah, we're all trying to be like a flame that rises up and to always be aspiring higher in spirituality. Perhaps that's, perhaps you could say there are principles there that would suggest there is a reason to be stringent in the matter. If your friend or yourself happen to enjoy sherry cask whiskey, are you a wicked sinner? Probably not. Although some people might call you that, but I won't. But there's definitely a lot more food for thought